All right. So can we have a show of hands for how many of you work remotely right now? Well, no guesses there. And how many? And is this a new concept for a few of you working working remotely? Probably you were working in a company where it was not remote. Anyone else for who is this a new concept? Ooh. We have a lot of people who are familiar with this, but it definitely is a new concept for a lot of other people out there, and it's only appropriate. And since we all have been working from home, it is only appropriate that we find ways to better ourselves and learn how to be more efficient. And I'm certain that after hearing what our guest speaker today has to say, you will have a few invaluable lessons that you can take back and implement to make remote work productive, successful, efficient, and even fun. So with that, allow me to introduce our guest speaker. Professor Robert Pozen is a senior lecturer at MIT Sloan and a senior non-resident of the Brookings Institution. He was the president of Fidelity Investments and executive chair of MFS Investment Management, and served as a senior official in both the federal as well as the state government. He's also the author of 7 books, including Extreme Productivity, one of the top-rated business books of 2012. And his latest book, Remote Incorporation, is a great read. It's easy and invaluable lessons in there. And he also offers MIT courses for executives on personal productivity and has been teaching online since the spring of 2020. Welcome, Bob. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Glad to be with you.
That's awesome. So let's jump right in. So, we have been working from home, some new, for some it's a new concept, for some we've been doing it for a while. I personally have been working from remotely for just about a year and even studying remotely. So I'm very excited to have this conversation with you and learn how to improve the skill. So in your latest book, Remote Incorporation, which was, like I said, an easy and valuable read, especially during these times, you write about how 9 to 5 is an obsolete concept. Would you tell us why 9 to 5 is not an appropriate way to define a workday?
Well, 9 to 5 is a relic of the industrial era where people were gathered in assembly lines and companies where the number of hours you put in was a pretty good proxy for your productivity. But in a knowledge economy, it pretty much makes no difference what your inputs are. People are interested in the outputs, the results. So if you're, for instance, putting together a new product, people, if you take 3 weeks to do it and it's not a good product, well, people don't say, great, you took 3 weeks to do it. If it took you 3 hours to do it and it's a great product, they don't say, well, it only took you 3 hours, so we're not interested in this product. So what people are interested in knowledge-based economy is what are your results? So we ought to have a system of productivity that's based on results.
Okay, and would result be a good approach, that result orientation, would that be a good approach to replace that 9 to 5 way of measuring a workday or productivity?
Yeah, so when I've talked to a lot of organizations, people have said, yeah, we realize that 9 to 5 isn't such a really good approach, but we can easily count hours. And we're a little worried that if we stop counting hours, we have no method to hold people accountable. And so you saw this in the pandemic where some companies started to put software on their employees' computers so that they could figure out how many hours they were working. What they're really saying is, if we get off hours and people are just working from home, how do we know they're not practicing their golf swing? How do we know they're not going to the beach? So I think if we want companies and organizations to move off hours work, we have to supply them with an alternative method of accountability. And that's why we've come up with the idea of success metrics. What we mean by success metrics is that these are the results that you and your boss agree are appropriate at the end of a big project, or at the end of the week, end of the month, whatever the relative time frame is. And by having these sorts of specific success metrics, then everybody's on the same page. So I'm a great believer in success metrics because, first of all, it clarifies between you and your boss what exactly you're trying to accomplish. A lot of times, people who are leading teams bring out some well-intentioned but pretty vague ideas, and the people on the team really don't know what exactly they're supposed to be doing. So if the head of a team says he or she wants to increase customer service, for instance, people can have very different ideas about what that is. So by having success metrics, maybe you're concentrating on problems resolved, maybe you're reducing the number of rings the phone has, maybe you're increasing customer revenues, maybe you're increasing visits to the customers. So these are all ways in which you can reasonably interpret customer service, but by having success metrics, you clarify that. The second is, once you have success metrics, it means it frees up the employee to work when and how and where they want to, because it doesn't really matter where and when and how they're working, as long as they're producing the results. So we found in our surveys, this autonomy is critical. It's critical to both your degree of productivity, because then you can work at the hours and the places that you consider most efficient. And then it's also increases your job satisfaction, because you have flexibility to meet your personal needs, to meet your family needs. And lastly, it's good for the team manager, the supervisor, the boss, because instead of spending a lot of time supervising you and micromanaging you, then he or she has a lot of time to devote to more productive endeavors, like getting a new product or getting some new customers. So to us, success metrics is really the practical way that you make a system of remote work effective. It's good for the company, it's good for the employees, it's good for everybody.
Yeah, and that's a great way. And like you said, if your manager and you can agree on the success metrics, it would definitely free up some time, and you don't really need so much of face time to be there from 9 to 5. In your book, you also speak about business for one. Would you care to elaborate a little bit on that? What does that really mean?
Yeah, so that's a new concept we introduced. It's actually the business of one,
Of one, I'm
but
sorry.
which is okay. But what we mean by that is, when you're working remotely, you ought to think of yourself as if you own a small business. And the business of one means there's one person in that business, but you own it. And that means that you're controlling your destiny, you're controlling your resources, you're controlling your time. And that implies a very different relationship with your boss. So it's not like your boss is this person who stands on high and delivers these orders to you. Under the business of one, it's like you're dealing as you would if you were a contractor or a vendor. So your boss is like your client, and you have that sort of relationship. So your boss can establish the receivables, the deliverables, the things that you're going to do. But your boss is like your client in that he or she doesn't determine exactly how you use your time and resources. That's up to you. So if you had a client, you would agree to deliver certain widgets or certain services within a certain time frame. And then, sort of you have the ability to control when and where those will be delivered. So we think that's a different mindset. So the business of one is the mindset that we want to see remote workers have. And success metrics are sort of like the practical way that you make this new relationship between employees and their clients, parentheses, boss, work. And so that's what we advocate in the book.
Yep. And you're right. It is definitely a mindset. And I think this mindset is definitely important in all companies, but especially in a growing startup. I think it would be definitely a good one if everybody treated their work as business of one, and their boss as a client that they need to meet the demands for.
Yeah.
At this point, I would like to pause for just a minute and see if we have any questions from the audience. Feel free to ask any questions or shout out or raise your hands, anything. Oh, I see. Eileen.
Hi. Does the business for one work for everyone, or are there exceptions? Just trying to gauge if this can be standardized and scaled, or if it depends on team and managers' dynamics.
Well, I think you're right to say that exactly. The business one is a concept. It's a concept that says you own your own time and your own resources. So in that sense, it applies to everybody. But exactly how that application is going to operate will depend on different teams and different groups. Because if you have, for instance, a group of software developers, you might say, okay, you're going to have a negotiation with the boss, who's now like your client, as to what your deliverables are at the end of every day or the end of every week. So that's a very different sort of discussion than you might have between the team leader and somebody who is trying to promote marketing and sales. So that might have a much longer time frame, and the success metrics might be broadened out. So the business of one is a mindset which essentially pushes the initiative, pushes everything to you as the employee, where you're not standing back passively and try to take instructions from your boss, and that instead once you know the deliverables, then you gain control of how you use your time and where you spend your time. So in that sense, it's uniform, but it's, how it operates is going to differ from teams to teams. The concept is good wherever you are. I used to run Fidelity, and I had a very large group of people reported to me. And I came to realize that if each one of them waited for detailed instructions from me, we'd never get anything done. Because what we really want is, we want to have some objectives, some deliverables, and projects and things like that. But I want them to take the initiative to figure out how and where to get this done. I don't want them to keep coming back for me every hour or every day for instructions. So that's what I'm really trying to connote here. I'm connoting that you're the active person, you're the business owner.
Thank you. We have a couple
Thank you.
I think we have a couple of hands raised. Catherine.
Hi. So as individuals, how do we keep ourselves accountable using the business of one concept?
Okay, well, you're talking about whether as individuals, meaning
like
you're not
personally. How do we personally keep ourselves accountable?
Okay, well, if are you talking about a situation where you're working within an organization, or you're working as an independent contractor?
Within an organization.
Okay, well, I think if you're working within an organization, you have some sort of boss, right? And your boss sets some objectives for you within some time frame. Let's say you have some big project and you say that's due at the end of the month, or trying to promote more sales within some certain week. Then it's up to you to negotiate with your boss a specific set of deliverables. That's what we mean by success metrics, so that you and your boss will get on the same wavelength and say, okay, here's this project. Let's assume you want to put on a presentation for your biggest client. and it's due in a week. So you say, okay, this is due in a week, and what we want is a slideshow. What we need is text. What we need is various things. And so you've agreed on success metrics. So then that's how you can hold yourself accountable. And the good news is it's the same way your boss is holding you accountable, because you don't want to be held accountable in a way, you don't want to hold yourself accountable in a way that's different from what your boss is doing, because then you're going to get into trouble. So these success metrics are ways in which you can make express and explicit what your boss's expectations are, which you may want to modify. You can say, well, really, this isn't realistic to get done in a week. I can do all these things, but it's going to take me 2 weeks. So then we have a negotiation. And then once you agree to the 2 weeks, then you are holding yourself, and your boss is holding you accountable. So that's the way it produces. So it produces the best sort of accountability, because you're holding yourself accountable to the measures that are furthering the goals of your organization and are consistent with the goals of your boss. So I hope I'm being clear on that.
Yeah, thank you.
That's a good question.
And that is also a great segue to my next question. I know we have a couple of more hands raised. Would you guys mind waiting till the end?
You should take the questions.
Okay, let's take the questions. Benjamin.
The last thing we want to do is talk at people. Who else has a question?
Oh, Benjamin, are you muted? Okay, there you go.
I have one question. I can see definitely the benefits of a results-oriented approach, but I wonder, how can you convince your manager to adopt this method?
Okay, well, that's one of the questions that Shiftali was going to ask me, because she's wondering that. And like, I've had that question a lot. You know, when I teach this course at MIT, at the end, some executives say to me, that's a great system, but my boss wants me in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he checks me every 2 hours. And if I'm not there, I'm in trouble. So I need to stay there. In fact, I stay there till 9 p.m. at night just to convince him I'm working hard. Now, in fact, I'm playing video games for 3 hours in the afternoon, but you know, I'm there at 9 p.m. Doing FaceTime. So I understand that some bosses are very reluctant to get off hours, because it's so easy to measure and it seems like it's so disciplined, even if it's irrelevant to productivity. So what I like to suggest is this: sit down with your boss and say to him or her, let's try this out. I heard this crazy guy from MIT who had this great idea, and let's try it out. Take a project for next week, and let's agree on what the results you want me to achieve. And then don't bug me for the whole week. And let's see if I can produce those results. And if you can, especially if you do a great job, then your boss is going to say, hey, there's a pretty good system. I really don't, most bosses actually don't really like to go around and check up on you all the time. They know when they're being a nudge and a pain in the butt. So, and they have better things to do with your time. But you've got to sort of run like a pilot project to convince them that this is an effective way. And everybody where I've suggested and they've done it, gradually their boss buys onto it. But it's a learning process. And I agree, great question. It's not something that every boss is just going to say, hey, I'm ready to give this up. Some of them are reluctant. Good.
All right. We have one question from Brian.
Hello. So one component you hinted on that I kind of use in when I manage the team that I have here at Liveewire is I want to empower my team to make those autonomous decisions on their own. So we do nebulous tasks or nebulous items. What I have for our support staff is a run loop. It's the list of things you need to keep an eye on throughout the day. You just kind of basically keep an eye on these 4 things in this order. If you're done, then you have other tasks that can fill in the gaps. But what I like about what you said is empower your workers to be able to make those decisions on their own without having to. Micromanagement is never fun. Unclear specifications are never fun. I do give, everybody on our team the latitude to do those types of things where they can make the decisions and, fix customer issues or make a command decision in split seconds that solves a problem that they need to solve right now, instead of waiting on, management or somebody higher up to sign off on it.
Well, I think that's great what you're doing, and it makes a lot of sense. And you're giving people guidelines every day. The only thing I want to add is, if you're dealing with large, important, big budget projects, I don't want to preach abdication of the manager. And this gets into our next part of our discussion on managing a team, because I think after the manager sets the deliverables and the success metrics, the manager needs to check in regularly, not every day, but those are what I call mid-flight reviews, to see how people are doing, see if they need some consulting help, see if they need some more resources, and try to be helpful. So there's a big difference between being a micromanager and being a supportive manager. And that distinction is critical. So I don't want to suggest that we just let everybody go for a month and we never check in. That's not the sort of system I'm thinking about. And I call them mid-flight reviews. But that's a great segue to where we were going to go. Thanks for providing it. So back to our Shiftali.
Thank you. So yes, you're right. Great segue. So in terms of managing teams, you speak about effective managers setting ground rules for their teams, and using other strategies to be more effective in leading their teams. What do you mean by setting ground rules, as well as what other strategies should they use?
Okay, so what I mean by ground rules, and this is especially important for remote work, when people were thrown into remote work a year ago, very suddenly, a lot of people didn't know what sort of expectations they should have. So I hear people saying, well, I was just on 24/7 because I figured I was at home and I had a computer, and so I didn't know when I was supposed to be off. Or other people saying, well, if I got a message, I thought I had to return it within 20 minutes. So by ground rules, I mean the basic ground rules of communication. So one would be, what hours are you expected to be on and accessible to your computer? Second of all, when messages come, whether they come through the Slack channel or they come through emails, who are you supposed to respond to first? How quickly you're supposed to be responsive, and just whatever expectations are there in the team. How are you supposed to respond to your peers? How are you supposed to respond to your customers? So that's what I really think is that, especially when your team starts to work remotely, or when you have new members of the team who are onboarded, there's no way that they actually know what the expectations of the organization or the team manager is. So it's the role of the team manager to show them and to explain. And I really like to see it explicitly in writing. It's sort of like it's like a mini employee handbook. And then you ask more generally, what other strategies? So I've found that when people are working remotely, the manager has to work a lot harder. He or she has to work a lot harder to communicate a lot better, because the natural ways in which people informally communicate in an office just aren't there. So I'd start off by saying that a manager needs to have a weekly team meeting. Now, the problem with most weekly team meetings is that they're backward looking. People just report on what they did during the last week. To me, that's a bad use of a team meeting, because what you did last week can be sent by email or in the Slack channel. What you really want is a team meeting that's forward looking, where you discuss, this is what my plans are for the week. Let me take input from various people. I want to solicit some help, maybe help with dealing with people at other organizations, maybe help in trying to find resources. Second of all, I think the team manager really needs to check in with his or her direct reports at least once a week. People complain a lot that when they're working remotely, they feel very isolated. They feel very distant from the team. And some of them are struggling with personal issues. And it makes a big difference to them if the manager calls up, even if it's for 20 minutes a week, and sort of goes over, well, how are you feeling? How are things going? And is there something we can do to make you more effective? A third thing is, I really think that teams and organizations, if they're going to have people remotely, really need to spend the resources to help people have good online connections, good computers, to have Liveewire, and to have other good support, have desk support, these sorts of things. So, I mean, companies can save a lot of money if people aren't coming into the office, and they need to spend a little money to help people in their own offices. Fourth is, I'd like to see people and teams hold social occasions in which business is not the main point on the agenda. So we've all heard of, cocktail hours and virtual lunches, but people have gotten a lot more creative with games. And I had a client who delivered food to all of his team, and he had cooking lessons, and people all had the same ingredients. So it was really a lot of fun, and it created the sort of personal bonds that I think are really important in a team. So those are some of the things that a team manager needs to do. So in a remote setting, we want to see team managers be very active in helping support their teams.
Thank you. And our team, SignalWire as well, had food delivered. We did not have the ingredients because some of us might be really terrible at cooking, but we did
that's why
have.
you're going to have cooking lessons, so you're going to
know.
be much better.
Do not underestimate our disaster of cooking skills. but so those were some great strategies for leaders, for team managers. What would you say is a good way for a manager to provide feedback to their teams? And this is one of my favorite questions, especially because my manager is sitting in the audience right now. So what do you think about having annual performance reviews, and how often should they be giving feedback? Yeah.
So I'm president of the Anti-Annual Performance Review Club. It's a very specialized club, but we have a lot of members. So most annual performance reviews are terrible. I mean, people sit down, they do it reluctantly. They do it for an hour at the end of the year. There's some sort of little memo that's written, and it's filed in the circular file, and nobody hears about it again. So it's really not really helpful. So what I want to see is periodic performance feedback. And so after every major project, after at least once a quarter, you want to sit down with your team member. And remember, you have all these success metrics. So you have some good objective measures, and you can talk about what were the success metrics that you achieved, and have a little celebration about that, some real positive reinforcement. And then if there were things that didn't go so well, you can try to figure out what was the problem and what you can do about it. So, I think especially when people are working remotely, they need what I call periodic feedback. So your manager ought to give you feedback after this session. Did you do a good job in putting together the questions? Were you entertaining? And, I really am in favor of that. The other thing, I just riff one more point here before we'll take questions is, I've interviewed a lot of managers, and they all say they give tremendous amount of positive reinforcement to the people who work for them. But you know what? If you speak to the people who work for them, they never feel they're getting enough. I've never met employees who say they're getting enough positive reinforcement. So there's a real mismatch there. So the point of periodic feedback is not to just bring up all the problems. The point is also to give you really good positive reinforcement. So we don't want to forget that part.
All in for positive reinforcement. Any questions? We are end of this session. I see, John, your hand is raised.
Yeah. Hey, hello, sir. Nice to have you on here. I'm loath to bring up your previous work, but it's actually what I'm most familiar with. You wrote a book in the early 2010s that I read alongside. Actually, I read GTD. If you're familiar with David Allen's Getting Things Done book. And I found a lot of what you wrote to be symbiotic with GTD. I would love to know your feelings about GTD, but I'd also like a little bit of precision on you brought up I think it was called Ohio, or only handle it once. I think that was the concept that you pick something up and you only. David Allen also he says something very similar. I think his approach is don't think about something twice unless you like the thought. Unless it's a thought that's pleasurable to have, don't think about it twice.
Well, okay.
Sorry.
So I think David Allen is a very smart guy, and he's written a lot of good stuff. I like to think of my stuff as a little broader than David Allen. You know, he spends a lot of time on exactly how you should organize your desk and where you should put the various pieces of paper, and that's a little too micro for my taste. I think that most people need principles that will help them be more productive. And as you say, the one principle that you're referring to is one that people often remember from my prior book. It's called Ohio, Only Handle It Once. And by that, I mean that if somebody sends you something that's really important, like your boss or your spouse or the IRS, just answer it right then and there if you can. Because think about the two alternatives. One is you forget about it completely, and then the IRS comes and assesses your house or takes your car away, you know? So that's a pretty bad result. The other possibility is a week from now, you remember it. It's in some sort of holding pattern, holding box with 200 other urgent messages. And then you spend another half an hour trying to find it. So that's pretty inefficient too. And the good news is if it's really an important message from an important person and you respond to it right then and there, well, they feel good. And that's a big plus for you, because by definition, this is someone who's important. So I'm a supporter of David Allen. I'd like to think that I'm more principle based than he does. He's a little too detailed. I think it was the part where he got into how you should put the various paper clips on your desk. I thought that was really, it got a little too micro for my taste.
Yeah, for sure. No, thank you very much. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions before we move on? All right. Thank you, John, for asking the Ohio question. You kind of jumped ahead in our format, but that's totally fine. I am absolutely guilty of, replying to a message in my head and not actually doing it. So once I read about the Ohio, concept, I am trying hard to do that. And, once I see a message, I'm trying to reply to it, immediately.
It's very powerful, because when I used to go to my publisher, HarperCollins in New York, I'd walk in and people would say, I'm much more productive. I'm doing Ohio. So it's catching on. Maybe we'll catch on in Columbus, Ohio. I don't know.
All right, Abby, I see your hand is raised. We'll take another question before we move on to the next section.
Oh yeah, I was thinking about what you're saying about how you're anti-annual performance review, and I was thinking how everyone enjoys getting positive feedback all the time, but I'm curious what your approach is to maybe not negative feedback, but to giving constructive criticism. I used to be a teacher, and we always well, we had a nickname for it, but we call it the negative feedback sandwich, you know, where you do the nice thing and then the not so nice thing and then another nice thing. But how do you handle maybe performance reviews that aren't so good?
Okay, well, performance feedback.
Feedback, sorry.
Yeah, so I think there are certain principles involved. One is you have to, as you say, start with positive and then bring up the negative. The second thing is you have to be careful not to attack the person, not to attack things that feel like you're not smart or you're not a good person, or you're not ethical. You need to put what the problem is in terms of a behavior, and therefore your solution is to change your behavior. So you don't say essentially you're a personality that no one likes to deal with. You say, look, I think in meetings you need to sort of be a little less aggressive and give some more people some chance to talk. So you need to couch it in terms of behavior rather than a personal thing. And then lastly is your whole effort has to be, rather than blaming, is to prevent this from happening again. And that's really the key. And I used to have a saying when I was president of Fidelity is, let's make a new mistake. And by that, I mean, it's okay to make the first mistake and we'll discuss it. We'll figure out how to prevent it. We'll put in measures. But if you make the same mistake several times, then I think you really have to be accountable for that. So I'm not of the view that everybody's okay and it's great and we just discussed this. You know, I do hold accountable, but I think you owe it to your team to figure out why the mistake occurred, why the problem occurred, and to put in procedures to prevent it from happening again. And, you know, so that's sort of the way I approach it. Good question.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby. Okay, moving on. So since we are talking about giving feedback, so that brings us to communicating with your team. And in this remote environment, we all have periods when the entire day gets consumed by a lot of messages, emails, and everything. And they're not necessarily a lot, but each one of them, like you said, takes time and energy. So do you have any tips on how to deal with this messaging overload?
Yes, well, that's something that I spent a lot of time on because messaging overload is one of the two most important time sinks that prevents people from being productive. The other meetings we can talk about in a second, but everyone gets too many messages, too many emails, too many Slack. Sometimes I feel like you get so much, like you feel flooded. So what you really need to do is to get very disciplined. And first you decide how to set up filters. And in the book, we discuss in detail how you set up these filters. And filters are really a way of saying, here are the things that actually I want to come to my primary email box. But there are lots of things that I want to just discard. I want them to go to junk immediately. And other things are things that maybe I'll take care of on the weekend when I have a choice. And then second of all, you'll still get emails and you should look at the person who's sending, the sender, and the subject matter. And I believe you need to skip over at least 50% of those. So you can't feel any compulsion about reading all your emails. In fact, you've got to get into a flow where you're skipping over 50, 70%, because most of them are not worth reading. And you can tell that by the sender. You know, for instance, I once gave money to a political candidate in a state where I wasn't involved at all, Montana, where I thought I wanted to support a certain person who was running for Senate. And then I started getting solicitations for money from literally it felt like everybody was running in a political campaign throughout the United States. And they kept sending me this stuff from Iowa, from South Dakota, places where I knew nobody. I knew nothing about it. I was totally unconcerned. I kept trying to, put in junk or, unsubscribe, but they have a way to just keep coming back. So those are the sorts of things. And we all get newsletters, and you get reports from charities that, God, you really just don't even know what the charity is, or you get the zillionth report on AI and its implications for something or other. I mean, it's just in a place like MIT, you could probably get 10 emails a day on just some version of the AI question, the AI story. So you really got to get tough with yourself about doing that. And so if you can discard 50 to 70% of your messages, and you can set up these filters to automate that process, then you can concentrate on the ones that are important. And as we said, use Ohio to do that. So I think that's the sort of discipline that you really need to take.
I know, I definitely do. We see one more hand raised. Jason?
Okay, so I just have a quick question regarding like office hours. Obviously, when we all worked from offices, you say I walk into the door at 8 o'clock, I leave the door, or I leave at 5 o'clock, and that's it. Like there is a reasonable expectation that at a certain level, you don't really have to put in very many additional hours and whatnot. But with the world that we live in right now with Slack and how it's pretty much anybody who's working, somebody could be working on the other side of the country or the other side of the world. It's daytime for them, it's nighttime for me, or something like that. How cognizant should we be of like the recipients? Like if we're sending a message of the times that they are, or should we save our messages so and then just send it during official work hours, or is that something that we should probably like send it, but then it's the expectation that the person receiving it knows that they're not working right now, so they don't necessarily need to answer it unless it's like super, super urgent?
Okay, well, that's a good question. And that's what I mean by ground rules that managers should set. So we should have people's expectation. So I wrote this book with a woman who lives in Vancouver, and we used our time differences to our advantage. So she could finish up a chapter, send it to me in draft, and then I could work on it in the morning. And by the time she got up, there it was ready and edited. But I think you have to be explicit about this. So if you send someone a message, which is at 2 a.m. their time, you can't just assume that they know that they're not supposed to respond.
Exactly. Yes.
So you ought to say, hey, I'm sending this message to you. It's actually 4 p.m. my time. I realize it's 2 a.m. your time. So don't feel like you have to respond it till you start working. And, that's okay with me. Now, if something is really, truly urgent, where you really need an answer right away, okay. But that rarely happens. So I think you need to be much more explicit about what your expectations are. And then in terms of the ground rules, if you have a group that's working across the country, you might say, well, here are the common hours that everybody's working from, say, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And so therefore, those are the times in which we expect everyone to respond within a few minutes getting it. But outside of that, we have a different approach. So that's what I mean by setting those.
Great.
And I do like your suggestion about writing down these ground rules too, just so it's more clear and everybody's on the same page. So we spoke about message overload. Now we also have a lot of video meetings, of course, being that everything is now remote. So do you have any advice on how can these video conferences be made more productive?
Yeah, so we see lots of people with back-to-back video meetings, and my strong view is you shouldn't schedule yourself that way. I believe strongly that everybody needs at least an hour in the morning and an hour in the afternoon for thinking time. And if you keep going to meetings and that's all you do, you'll never have a chance to think. So you want to really prevent that from happening. Now, how do you do that? Well, my suggestion is when someone sends you a meeting request, you ought to send it back and say, please send me the agenda for this meeting so I can decide whether I should be present or not. There are lots of meetings that people just go to because their routine or this and that. And that's how they clutter up their lives with meetings. Then beside agendas, we want to have people who lead meetings really establish the meeting in the first 10 minutes, saying, this is what we have, this is the subject, and this is what we want to decide, and then leave most of the meetings for discussion and debate. The problem is we see some leaders who spend, all of the first 50 minutes of an hour meeting essentially going over the materials that you've been sent. And if you're sent advanced materials and the leader goes over them, after a while, you're never going to read them. So that's a really bad habit to induce. Then the other thing about meetings is you want to have good, there are so many meetings that all of us have been where at the end, people don't know what happened. They walk out of the meeting and they say, gee, I wonder what was actually decided there. So again, I want express activity, express actions in which you agree, this is what we decided, these are the next steps, and this is who has responsibility for the next steps and in what time frame. So good meetings are, first of all, try to reduce the number of meetings by only the ones where you're really important to the agenda. And then have a good opening, have a good closure, and most important, try to keep down the time of meetings. I often am invited to 3 and 4 hour meetings, and my rule at Fidelity was no meeting more than 90 minutes. And I can assure you, any meeting that's scheduled for 3 hours can be done in 90 minutes. You just have to have a little discipline to do that.
We at SignalWire are 100% in support of short meetings. We a lot of times do not schedule any meetings. It is really just hopping in and out of a room to ask a question if it would just take a minute rather than, blocking out 30 minutes of time in your calendar. So we do that quite a bit.
I agree totally here.
All right. So does anybody have any question? We've reached the end of this section. Before we move on to the next one, I don't see any hands raised. All right.
Well, let's go to the last section then.
Yes. So we just want to talk more about hybrid workplace. Is that the future? So last year...
It is the future. I'm going to tell you, the future is partly remote and partly in the office. We've done a lot of surveys on this subject, and there are very few companies and people who want to be remote all the time, and there are very few people who want to be, and companies want to be in person all the time. So the question is, how do we design the optimal hybrid? And we call it in the book the Goldilocks plan, not too much remote work and not too little. But that turns out to be a pretty complicated question. And that's what a lot of organizations are doing now.
So how would the Goldilocks system work? How do you have a hybrid? Would it get complicated? Who's coming in when? How do you work on the collaboration?
So what we do is we have this acronym, FLOCS, F-L-O-C-S. And so we say that every organization should analyze these 5 factors. F is function. What the behavior of the what's the nature of the job? Is it more collaborative? Does it require lots of brainstorming? That would suggest people need to be more in person. On the other hand, if it's more where you need extensive time to reflect, to write yourself, to think, well, that should be more at home. L is for location. If you're all in and around a modest-sized city like Minneapolis, well, then it will make a lot of sense for the team to come into the office. But if you're in a place like LA, where you have to drive an hour and a half each way, well, you got to think twice about doing that. O is for organization. How is the company or nonprofit organized? And I emphasize this because I don't think there ought to be the same rule for every team in the organization. take financial services, where I know it the best. You have an investment team, you have a technology team, you have a marketing team, you have a customer service team. So these factors can be very different for each team. So you got to think about, what does the team do and how is the team organized? C is for culture in the FLOX acronym. And most of the senior managers I talk to feel like coming into the office is really important to maintaining the culture of the company. And I agree with them, but that doesn't mean that you have to be in the office 5 days a week. For organizations that are spread out across the country, I actually like to see them come together 2 or 3 times a year so that people can meet each other and they can maintain the culture. I know one company that I'm involved is brings the senior executives of the company to one city on the East Coast 1 week a month, and that's where they try to make the big decisions. And S is just for scheduling, the practical questions of how do you get people together. And my strong view is that you got to have the members of the team come into the office on the same days each week. That's where you're getting the benefits of collegiality and collaboration. And that has the secondary benefit of reducing real estate costs. So you can have 2 teams rotating through the same space, and that will cut your real estate cost in half. And the other thing I like about it is I'm sort of disenchanted with hoteling and hot desking. I think people will feel a lot better if they come in the office and they have a space that they think of as theirs, even if it's shared with another person. So those are the 5 factors that you have to analyze, and to analyze it not just for the whole organization, but for each team. And then that will help you design what's an optimal hybrid for your organization.
So you mentioned that, if, let's say, one of the factors you said was if it's close by, if everybody's living close by, have it in the office. If they're in LA who have to drive like an hour and a half, it's something to think about. So in that sense, how much should organization defer to the wishes of individual employees?
Well, I'm generally of a bit of on the one hand, on the other hand, on that. I think to the extent feasible, you should recognize individual choice. But more and more, the work of a lot of organizations is done as teams. So I don't think you should say if the organization wants it, then you have to do it. I don't think you should say if the individual wants to do it, you always do it. It's really the team. So I'm saying is you recognize individual choice to the extent possible, but in the end, the team has to take priority over individual choice. But as I said, I don't think you ought to have the same rules and the same design for every team within the same organization, because teams within that organization are doing very different things.
Absolutely. All right. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Well, we're coming to the end of our session here. So do people like the idea of the Goldilocks plan? I thought that was a pretty nifty label on that. So
it really was.
Are you guys going to be moving toward hybrid now that we're moving out of remote? There are lots of places that tell me they're going to move back toward hybrid after Labor Day, but it depends a lot on exactly where you are. I don't know. Are people in the process of trying to figure that out?
So SignalWire has been remote since inception. It was not a new concept that was brought upon by the pandemic. So definitely a question for the executive board, but I should not be speaking on their behalf. But that's what it is.
Is there any in-person aspect to this? Do people gather together a few times a year, or?
We do. We actually have a major event coming up in October where hopefully I will be seeing, majority of the colleagues in Chicago. So yeah, we do try to meet in person.
Well, I think that is important. I think if people meet in person, say twice a year, then they can work remotely much more effectively throughout the rest of the year.
Right.
Because
I do see a couple of questions. Joe, you have your hand raised.
All right. So we talked a lot about the kind of the in-person work from home split, but how do you feel or see other, call it alternative models and variables playing into kind of that Goldilocks plan? Like, let's say shorter work days, shorter work weeks, maybe more vacation days, flex time, things like that.
Well, I think that goes back to success metrics and results oriented. So my view is I don't really care how many days, what the length of your work week is. What I care is what you get accomplished. And if you can get a tremendous amount accomplished in 3 days, I don't care whether you work 5 days a week. So I think that's the beauty of a results oriented approach. So I don't want to get hung up on that. I also don't want to get hung up on vacation days. Again, if you're getting huge amount done, then you want to take a vacation, do it whenever it's convenient for you. I used to run, in an investment operation, you're most interested in when, what's their investment, the analysts, what's their picks, what's their stock recommendations? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they mediocre? So I didn't care, and I still don't care when they do their work, or whether they work 3 days or 5 days or 7 days in a row and then take time off. So I would say you really want to move to results-oriented approach as much as possible and keep the requirements for time in the office or time with the team to what you need to have good team activities and good coordination and good camaraderie and good collaboration. So I view that as the way to go, and subject to the team requirements. I don't want to set a work week, and I don't want to set vacation days. I want to let that roll out.
I love that we are having this conversation in front of my manager. So we'll take one last question. I know we're a minute over time, but I see one hand raised. Brett.
Hey, so this is actually my first completely remote job. And before that, I've dealt a lot in office spaces. And naturally for myself, I'm an introvert. And while there are like a lot of really good parts about remote work, especially with work-life balance and how that plays into it, it's often really easy for people like me to get stuck in a bubble, so to speak, because I can just easily just kind of hide in the comfort of my own living room without talking to anybody. Whereas used to, you get pulled into meetings or, that classic water cooler talk or whatever. Do you have any tips as how, as a team, we can actually encourage that same level of camaraderie and try and pull people out of their shells a little bit?
Well, I think it's a good question, and I think partly the answer lies in the manager of your team, so that your manager needs to be very proactive to make sure that he or she is interacting with you and also encouraging other of your peers to interact with you. And there are a lot of people who are naturally introverted and won't have that many relations. And so you really want to do that. You really want to have a team manager who does that. Second of all, you yourself need to take the initiative and not just wait for team meetings. You should try to set up conversations one-on-one with your team members in which you discuss things that are of common interest. And third of all, you ought to figure out ways to meet in person, even if it means like you're going to meet at a Starbucks with somebody who lives in the same suburban area, and start to develop some interpersonal relations. Because I can tell you that all the studies that are done is after people were working remotely for 6 months, a lot of them get pretty lonely. And that's not a good thing for their productivity and not a good thing for them personally. So partly it's on the manager, but it's partly on you to make sure that you have phone conversations and you meet in person from time to time with your colleagues. then I think that's really a good idea for anyone in your situation.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you so much, Bob, for taking the time out. We really appreciate all the tips and advice that you've given us. Hopefully this will make our remote working experience even more efficient.
Well, and hopefully some of you at least will take a look at the book. You can get it very inexpensively on audio or on ebook. It's remote incorporated.
I have just posted the link for that in the chat section.
Good. How to thrive when working wherever you are. So it's a fast read. It's fun, and it has takeaways at the end of every chapter, so it's very practical. And thank you, Shiftali. I'm giving you positive reinforcement.
Ooh, I need to go attend a meeting after this with my manager, to get that feedback after every project.
You were very organized in putting this together, and you're very a good moderator. And I think we had a lot of good interaction, which I can assure you that there are too many video meetings in which people just passively look in the screen, and after a while they have no idea what's going on. They're just being mesmerized. So very good interaction, and thanks everybody for joining us. Great seeing you. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.